so much.
Oh, I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So you don't just beat it.
Take all these notes and just leave them lying around. No problem.
Next on stage to discuss OT insights from a weapon systems pen tester, culture, and candy shells is John McFly McElroy, who leads the offensive defensive team in MTSI's Weapon Systems Cybersecurity Group.
Hello, hello, hello. I am acutely aware that I'm all that stands between you and lunch. So my father was a preacher, and I promise not to follow in his footsteps and go long. Okay, a little bit about myself. My name is John McElroy. The clicker here. Move on to the next slide. Big green button to go to the next slide. There we go. Okay, a little bit of disclaimer. I had to get this brief approved through the DoD. So all of the really cool, juicy stuff I had to leave out, but don't worry, I have other juicy things that I brought in from open source that we can talk about to kind of back up my claims. So who am I? Well, I am not Tom Cruise, and that's not really Tom Cruise either. That's a lookalike, if you've seen him around. But sort of. I am a 22-year naval officer. I was a carrier jet pilot, a test pilot, an acquisition professional, and then I started doing a lot of cool cyber stuff as it relates to aviation, to maritime, to weapon systems. You need me over there more? Okay, awesome. Sorry. I was out of the, I want to be in the shadows. That's right. I like that as a hacker. I also have extensive experience doing teaching, software reverse engineering, vulnerability exploits, and research in exploit development. Software-defined radio is another area that I like. Some of my hobbies are amateur cocktail mixing, smoking meats, and I also really love assembly. I know, it's a penchant for pain. Currently, I lead the MTSI's Weapon System Cybersecurity Offensive Defensive Team. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what it is involved with testing weapons. I'm sort of a cousin. This is kind of like a Thanksgiving homecoming. You guys are cyber physical OT, right? I'm weapon systems. We kind of fit under the same umbrella. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what's involved with testing weapon systems. Where do weapons fit in cyber? And this is a generic diagram. There's always exceptions to everything. But if you think about kind of gross grouping of things. You've got OT and you got IT, right? And definitely weapons are going to fall under OT. They're going to fall under cyber physical because they've got things that move, things that go boom, and so forth. And so they're going to be in a lot of the same lines with the areas of expertise and products that many of you all use every day and work with, develop, and so forth. That's not to say there isn't crossover. In fact, many of the talks you heard today, and you'll hear the rest of the time here, are going to talk about that transition and bleed between OT and IT. What does it take, though, to test a weapon system? I heard one of the gentlemen up here talk about this a little bit earlier. He didn't know it, but he was kind of touching on it. It's important to understand the differences between pure cyber test, sort of traditional IT cyber test, and doing cyber physical testing, doing physical testing. Example would be flight test. How do you blend those requirements to make both effective cyber testing and have it be safe? When you think about cyber testing, oftentimes you think about spec compliance. It's got to do these things, so I'm going to go ahead and test all this out, and I'm just going to make sure that it works, and if it does, great, and if it doesn't, well, then we'll go back and we'll test it again. When I think about cyber testing, I think about adversarial testing. I think about trying to come in sideways and breaking assumptions and doing things sort of that the designers might not have thought of. Sometimes we hear that negative testing, you hear things like fuzzing and such like that. But how do you find a balance between the positive and the negative, especially when program managers are under the gun and they say, you got to get this testing done and you only have so much time? So understanding how to balance that is important. Another thing that's very important in testing weapon systems is to understand how to balance safety versus the need to explore the unknown. With safety, you think about things like flight envelopes and such like that. And of course, with OT, you are intimately aware of safety. But when you think about some traditional cyber testers, they see something shiny. Hey, what's that? Let's push the button. Let's see what happens, right? And oftentimes with cyber physical testing, you really don't want to go there. If you brick a $50 device, no big deal. If you brick a $5 million device, or maybe a device where there's only 5 of them in existence, then you're kind of having a bad day. So balancing that need is important. I wanted to talk a little bit about my perspective of testing weapon systems so that I could undergird what we're going to talk about next. I'm going to highlight trends that I've seen. And I think those trends apply to cyber physical, the broader sense. They apply to OT just as much as they apply to an aircraft or a ship or a missile that I might work on and test. So what are some of those trends that we see? And I think it stems from culture. And it's important to talk about this. And many of you, this is going to be no surprise, but it's important for us to remind ourselves of these things. I'm not going to talk about policy. I'm not going to talk about high-level things. I'm going to talk about some kind of pragmatic, tangible things you can kind of sink your teeth into as vignettes to kind of remind yourself of what we should all be trying to do in terms of cyber for physical systems. This is a qualitative slide. I do not have data to back it up for the gentleman that spoke earlier today. But this has just been my experience, what I've seen over decades of testing weapon systems and testing cyber physical systems. Again, no surprise to many of you that there may be a lag between the adoption of cyber practices in OT versus IT. IT grew out of the explosion of the web and the internet. It's been around longer, it's been exposed to what we call like security enhancing forcing functions, right? There's social media, there's security researchers, there's public exposures, there's open source, there's economics, and all of these things have sort of drug along and kind of forced IT to kind of adopt things, sometimes unwillingly, but to the betterment of everybody. OT grew out of this culture of mechanically disconnected systems. Obscuration was natural. Openness of security research was less accepted. I'll tell you, like in the aviation world, they're not really super keen on cyber testing. Some of them are now, and it's getting better, but it was far less accepted by the researchers. And so there's been this lag that's been involved there. And that gets to my next point, which is the subtitle of the talk, which is hard candy shells and soft, chewy centers. we have this term that we use called M&M security. You think about an M&M, it's got that hard candy shell. It looks kind of ominous. Tap on it, not really going to get through it. But if you tap in the right place hard enough, crack. And then what do you find in the middle? Everything's just soft and gooey, and I can go wherever I want. As an attacker, from that perspective, that's really nice for me because it just means I got a little bit of pain in the beginning, and then after that, it's smooth sailing. Again, this is a qualitative slide. No data to back this up, but this has been my experience and what I've seen. One might think that security increases with price, like quality and performance does. But that's not really been the case with what I've observed. One would expect that very cheap things would have very cheap security, and that's often the case. If you want a really interesting sort of exercise, go onto Amazon, search for like webcams, and then invert the search and look for the ones with the least amount of stars, and then go to their websites and download their firmware, and you find really interesting things, right? And it's no surprise that cheap things have cheap security. And their focus is on speed of delivery. Their focus is on bare minimum functions, minimizing development costs. And if they lose people because of security breaches, they're going to make up for it in volume because they got such low cost point. For medium and these are average terms, for medium cost solutions, you're going to see a little bit more investment in security, as you would in performance and so forth. The companies are invested in keeping their customers. They want a loyal customer base, and so they're going to bake more security in, put a lot of research in. So you would expect then that very expensive things might have extremely robust security. You think about like maybe a $65,000 SATCOM receiver. And that is not the case, at least in my experience and what I've seen with cyber physical systems. And it's not to say that there aren't solutions and vendors out there with security and investment. There are. I'm talking on average what I've seen as a whole. And so when you look then at the very, very high-end systems, which tend to kind of fall under the realm of weapon systems and aviation, maritime, and high-end cyber physical systems, you will find these very high price points, and then you'll find that hard candy shell and that soft, chewy center. How is it being addressed right now? Giant alphabet soup. There's all these things up there. And I'm not here to say these things are bad. These things add value. They're good. They're useful. They're things that have been adopted and carried over from IT into OT. They've been tailored for OT. But is that the only thing we should be doing? Is that the only thing we should be focusing on? Is that enough? Is the question that I'm posing here today. When we look at a lot of these tools, they often tend to be reactive. They tend to be about detection and mitigation. And one of the gentlemen set it up here earlier also. They talked about the fact that it costs a lot more to fix something on the back end than it does in the beginning on design. I think we all inherently know that. But I want to highlight where a lot of these tools focus and where the most bang for the buck can happen in terms of providing effective cybersecurity. A lot of these tools are very network-centric. They depend heavily on access to some cloud or some centralized network service. And OT, although there is a blending, and we see that all the time, there's a blending between OT and IT. There's a lot of emphasis on getting IT sensors and solutions access to the cloud so that data can be instantly retrieved. So that's certainly, I'm not contending that. But I think you would all agree that there will always be a case where OT solutions will be either disconnected entirely or have limited connectivity simply because of their design requirements and the environments that they work in. And so one cannot always require and assume that you're going to have a very robust network connection for a lot of these tools. So to get into it then, I want to talk about some of the meaningful things that I've seen in systems, testing weapon systems over and over, and a lot of themes, and just kind of put them out there and let them marinate in your brains and think about these. So one example is limited maintenance shells. We often see maintenance shells. They serve a valid purpose. They're there, and they are important. But sometimes they can be reached via networks or serial, and sometimes these shells do require authentication. Sometimes they don't. As an attacker, that's great if they don't, from my perspective. They're limited, meaning that they have a limited set of functions. They're there for someone to check on the health of a network or a system, to check and do maintenance and configuration. But what if an interesting combination of limited commands or limited command line arguments could lead to some sort of privilege escalation or information leakage? Example would be combining certain command line arguments to exfiltrate the firmware off of a system from the protected side. So who's doing an assessment of these limited maintenance shells and looking at, weird and odd combinations of commands and making sure that doesn't lead to some sort of attack leverage that you wouldn't want as a designer. Another one that we often see is systems with a full access debug terminal. These are enabled on production systems. They require physical access, so you might say, why do we care? It's in the back behind a cabinet and so forth. But I would say that in 2023, with the current threat models and things like supply chain, software and hardware attack, insider threat, social engineering, it's something to be paid attention to. These debug terminals often grant full access. It just takes hooking up some wires. For those that are familiar with UART or RS-232, RS-422, you name it, you're in and you got access to full memory, processes, files, and so forth. I see them on production systems. Are they needed? Why are they there? If there's a legitimate need, that's fine. But if there's not, turn it off, disable it. And I was in program management for military systems, and I understand it's not as simple as just saying turn it off, right? There's a process involved with acquisition, but I want to pose the question, why are they there and do they need to be there? Excess RF access points. We tend to think when we talk about RF, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, cellular, but there are a whole host of other RF types of protocols. In my realm, when I think about aviation and maritime, I think about things like AIS and ADSB, UHF comms, SATCOM, RFID, custom data links. We tend to say like, oh, no one's really going to be able to look at those because no one has the tools. Well, I'll tell you that there are people looking at them. And there's tools on GitHub for many of them. So the RF access points, what are they there for? Are they needed? And have you considered authentication and encryption? And if they're not needed, can you turn them off? Excess unused software. The software may be outdated also. Software upon software, open source software, closed source software, is that software really needed for the mission? Was it brought along as a part of a distro? Was it brought along as a part of a contract or an SBOM, but it really doesn't do anything? Or maybe it did before, but in the new version of the software, it isn't used. All software adds to the attack surface. All software is useful for what I'm trying to do when I'm attacking things, but not all software is needed for functional requirements. And worse yet, what if that excess software is outdated? And we know, especially with OT, the troublesome issue of software update as it, compared to or contrasted to IT. Speaking about outdated software and OS libraries, a perfect example of this is Log4Shell. What if core software or operating systems, what if they're outdated but they contain known vulnerabilities? Awareness is the first step. You cannot protect what you don't know you have. I can tell you stories about, pen tests and assessments where we say, what's out there? And they show us a PowerPoint slide. Here's what we have. And then we kind of walk around physically. What's that thing? What's that? Why are those two connected to each other? So understanding what you have is the very first step to being able to protect. What about debug and dead code? What I mean by that is code that was in there during development, but in the build process to production, that code gets left there. You might say, well, it's not being used, but if there's a way to trigger it from the outside, that dead code might be useful for an attacker to gain leverage and a foothold. So what if that dead code could be stimulated? What if it could be utilized through some data link, through some network communication, through some physical access? Who's checking for that? Has it been tested? What's the process whereby in your build and development and productions, your CI/CD pipelines, you mark something as saying, this should not end up in the production software hard-coded debugger vendor credentials. I see this all the time. It's part of maybe the development process, part of the QA or testing process, but it gets left in, and many people think, well, they don't have the source code, so they're not going to see it. But I'll tell you that many of the people in my realm and many of what we might consider the adversaries in the same realm have the same tools to be able to crack open software and find those things, even if you don't have the source code. So why are they in there? Why were they left in there? The desire, maybe to ease customer support, debugging during development. Maybe they were put in there by insider threats that you didn't know about. But hard-coded credentials, something very, very important to keep an eye on. Speaking of access through humans, as OT, there's a good emphasis on HMI, human-machine interface. It's needed, it's necessary, right? But we tend to go with things that work, and so we tend to go with web-based solutions for HMI. And so when we talk about those, who uses those HMIs? Who can touch them? Are they accessible on-prem? Are they accessible remotely? Do they do a good job of locking out functions and making sure that certain functions can only be executed when you're authenticated? We see these kind of things all the time where I can get to a part of the HMI without authentication, and that allows me to then leverage something like maybe a command injection through a text box in a web-based field, or gain an information leak about the system and learn something about it. Who's taking a look at the HMI and saying, are we doing proper input validation? Are we doing proper authentication validation as it relates to how human operators are going to interact with this HMI? Unencrypted, unsigned firmware. And I'll add to that, firmware available on internet-facing services. Why do we do this? Because it makes things easier, right? You want to be able to pull down the latest. But I'll tell you, when I pull down firmware and I find that it's encrypted with strong encryption, I get a sad face. And then I take an early lunch break because I'm not really going to go anywhere, or I'll have to find another way, right? But if I download firmware and it's not encrypted, it's like, awesome. Let's order something on DoorDash and let's go, because I'm going to be able to pull everything apart right there. I remember we had a conversation with somebody. We were talking about some, this was in the rail industry. We were talking about some cellular connectivity devices for rail. And they had just mentioned the model name, and I did quick Google search, found the company, found their support page, found the firmware download, downloaded the firmware, unpacked it, opened it up, and was rooting around the files, all within a matter of a few minutes while this gentleman was on the phone talking with me. What do you need? What do your customers need? So I'm not saying that you shouldn't have your firmware accessible to anybody. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is think about how you deliver your firmware to your customers and ask the question, is that what we want? Is that what we need? And is there a way to do it that also kind of closes off some of this? I want you to think about security is not a binary thing. It's not we're secure or not secure. It's a trade-off. It's all about resources and where you decide to invest. And it's about putting up enough hurdles. And if you put up enough hurdles against myself or somebody who's trying to attack you for real, they're going to go somewhere else. Logical protocol errors. There's a big assumption here. OT lives on protocols. It has to. It's systems and sensors communicating with each other, so they have to use protocols. Some of them are standards, things you think of like Modbus and so forth. Some of them are proprietary. But oftentimes there's one inherent assumption in many of these protocols, and that is that everyone will play nice. You're going to talk to me in a way that makes sense, that's grammatically, syntactically correct, and so I'm going to assume that. Whereas an attacker is going to look at that, and they're not going to make that assumption. They're going to say, what can I do with this protocol, and add, like example would be fields that have, it says it's reserved for future use. When I see fields like that in a protocol, oh, it's like Christmas. Like, let me go throw values in there and see what happens. When you think about these, protocol fields are complex. There's a lot involved in parsing, and that's where a lot of vulnerabilities come into play, is in parsing data. But it's still hard work that needs to be done. So there's problems all over the place, problems everywhere, right? We see these over and over again. So is all lost? Well, no, not, everything is lost. But the solution is not to rely solely on the latest detection software, backed by AI, backed by big data, right? And again, I'm not saying those things are bad. They are useful, and I'm excited about what they're going to bring to the field of cyber-physical, but they shouldn't be relied on solely. In fact, it's time to get back to the basics. You all have an opportunity to lead the way, to set trends, and to get back to minimizing your attack surface in a way that's going to make it a lot harder for attackers to try and focus on and leverage your systems. So you can be a leader, you can set the trend. Do not assume that the physical access requirement will save you. That assumption doesn't hold anymore. Do not assume that your proprietary algorithm or protocol will save you. That certainly doesn't hold anymore. I'll give you an example. There was a satellite provider, a very well-known commercial one. They relied on security through obscurity for their protocols for SATCOM, and there were a bunch of researchers out in Germany, some really cool researchers, but they developed all this code, they figured it all out, and they put it up on GitHub, and now with a couple $100s of cheap equipment and a laptop and the right type of antenna, you can be talking to those satellite systems. So that's not going to save you. Do not assume that the attackers will not be interested because your device is not on the internet or you don't have a GitHub page. Don't assume that. Hackers get bored sometimes. They're like, oh, that internet, that Wi-Fi stuff, we've done that for a while. What's the latest cool, interesting thing to go look at? If you go to a lot of the hacker conferences, there is a huge emphasis on cyber-physical systems, whether it be car hacking or ship hacking, satellite, and so forth. So the focus then should be on design requirements. What's the system needed? What does it need in terms of functionalities, and making sure that you're focusing on the minimum for that. Focus on least privilege at every level that you can. We're talking about minimizing and shrinking that attack surface up front during the design phase. Again, this is not anything new, but I think it's important to reiterate this for all of us to keep reminding ourselves of these things. Keep in mind the hacker mindset. I once worked on, there was an aircraft data link system. There was a pod that hung on the wing of fighter aircraft, and it would have this data link, and it was talking on the aircraft bus to be able to share information and everything. And these testers had built a simulator, an emulator for this data link pod. And so it would talk to the aircraft just like it was a real pod. And I said, hey, that's pretty cool. Could you make this simulator pretend to be the mission computer of the aircraft and try to mess around with things on the aircraft bus? And one of the engineers said, yeah, we could do that, but why would you want to? Right? So, make sure you have the attacker mindset, because if you don't, to quote a little bit of Sun Tzu, you're going to be in a troublesome spot because you don't know your enemy. Minimize your attack surface. We say this all the time, but hopefully I'm showing some practical ways that take that low-hanging fruit and just cut it out. And it's non-linear. What do I mean by that? If you take out that maintenance debug terminal, or you encrypt your firmware, that might be like a little bit of effort for you to do through your acquisition process. But as the attacker, when I see that, whoa, that just takes up way up the effort that I need to try and find another way in to your system. Input and protocol validation. We see this over and over again. We can talk about all the detection tools that we want, but a lot of this all boils down to validating input and validating protocols. So I would say, there should be a lot of heavy emphasis on that during the design phase and the testing phase to make sure that you're not just playing well with others, but you're trusting but verifying. You're assuming that someone's not going to play well and they're going to talk weird, and how are you going to handle that gracefully? Adversarial testing. This is important. We talk about cyber testing. One of the gentlemen up here mentioned penetration testing. That's what I do for a living. But it has to have an adversarial mindset. It can't be simply enough to take a tool and do a scan and produce a report. You have to come in sideways the way the attackers are thinking and break assumptions, because you have to mimic what they're going to do, and you have to understand how resilient is the system in the face of adversarial type attacks. Okay, and with that, I thank you for your time. I thank the conference for having me here. I have about 3 minutes left if there's any questions. And after the fact, I'll be in the back. Speaking of unused software, if you want to see my interesting QR code patch that I have that has an antivirus test file on it that can throw off a lot of optical character recognition systems, I'll let you take a look at that too. But are there any questions at this time? And just speak up, because with the lights, I can't see people's hands.
Just one quick question. Background on testing and training. So you yourself, what exactly, certifications, what kind of training have you performed or went through in order to get to this role that you have today?
So the question was, what kind of background, certification, and training do I have to be able to do this role? I'll tell you, I'm a bit of a contrarian here. I don't take a lot of stock in certifications. There are some certifications that are good. There are some that are just resume fodder, and I'm just being honest there. In terms of what it took, well, obviously I have a flight test background, so having somebody that has a lot of experience in those particular areas is going to be important, especially when it relates to that type of cyber physical systems. But the other is I've spent many years of grueling time working on very hard capture the flag contests and going through very hard training of learning to reverse engineer software, get down to the low level. And I will say this, for anybody who wants to do any of this kind of pen testing, learn assembly. You may go like, what? That's crazy. But assembly, if you learn that, it will just help you with this kind of work. Now, there are some certifications and courses. SANS has some really good ones and so forth. But I would say experience in that field is really important. Thank you. Any other questions? Well, if not, I yield back the remaining of my time. Thank you very much.
We will now be breaking for lunch. Please enjoy your meal outside in the Windsor Garden. We also invite you to attend the lunch workshop presented by Nozomi Networks in the Hope Room.